The winter of 1943 blanketed the Eastern Front with a cruel chill, each breath of air heavy with the scent of frost and decay. Snow covered the charred remains of villages and transformed the battlefield into a macabre painting of white silence and blackened ruins. The trenches, carved deep into the earth by desperate hands, were more than defensive positions. They were graves waiting for occupants. For the soldiers of the 13th Infantry Division, the trenches offered a fragile sanctuary against a relentless enemy, but they also harbored something more insidious, something that defied reason and lived only in whispers. For weeks, rumors had circulated among the men about the Forgotten Trenches, a section of the line abandoned after an entire platoon vanished overnight. No shots fired, no screams heard, their bodies were never found, and the only sign of their presence was the eerie stillness that lingered in the air like a bad omen. Command dismissed the rumors as wartime hysteria, but the soldiers knew better. Fear is a parasite, and it fed well in the desolation of war. Private Elias Kostov was the first to sense the unease when his squad was ordered to occupy the cursed trenches. Elias was no stranger to fear. He had seen friends fall beside him and had felt the tremor of his own mortality more times than he cared to count. But this fear was different. It wasn't the adrenaline-fueled terror of battle or the gnawing anxiety of waiting for the next assault. This fear was cold, ancient, and patient. It whispered to him in the wind and stared at him from the shadows. As the squad moved into the trenches, the first thing Elias noticed was the silence. Even the war seemed to respect the boundaries of this forsaken ground. The sounds of distant artillery and the hum of aircraft disappeared as they descended into the earth. It was as though the world above had ceased to exist. The trench walls, lined with frozen mud and remnants of the previous occupants, seemed to close in around them, suffocating any hope of escape. The squad settled in, their movements slow and deliberate, as though afraid to disturb the slumber of whatever watched them from the darkness. Sergeant Petrov, a grizzled veteran with scars to match his reputation, tried to maintain order. "Keep your heads down and your minds clear," he barked, though his own voice betrayed a crack of unease. "The enemy is flesh and blood, not ghosts." His words felt hollow, a feeble attempt to reassure himself as much as the men. It was on the second night that the whispers began. At first, they were faint, like the rustling of leaves or the distant murmur of a stream. But there were no leaves and no streams, only snow and silence. Elias awoke to the sound of his name being called, soft and deliberate, as though carried on the wind. He bolted upright, his rifle clutched tightly in his hands. "Who's there?" he whispered, his breath forming clouds in the frigid air. No response came, only the oppressive stillness. By the third night, the squad's morale had eroded like the trench walls under relentless rain. Men who once laughed at death now avoided each other's eyes. Corporal Andreev, a skeptic who prided himself on his logic, was the first to break. He claimed he saw figures moving at the edge of the trench, their silhouettes barely discernible against the snow. When the others looked, there was nothing there. "You're imagining things," Petrov growled, but his hand never left the hilt of his sidearm. Then came the discovery. Private Markov, while digging to reinforce the trench wall, unearthed a series of crude carvings etched into the frozen soil. Symbols unlike anything they had seen before, spiraled in patterns that seemed to move when stared at for too long. At the center of the carvings was a single word, written in a language none of them recognized, but somehow all understood. "Remember." Elias felt the weight of the word like a stone in his chest. That night, the whispers turned into voices, clear and guttural, speaking in tones that defied human vocal cords. They spoke of betrayal, sacrifice, and an unholy pact made long before any of them were born. Elias tried to block it out, stuffing his ears with cloth and muttering prayers he hadn't uttered since childhood. But the voices grew louder, drowning out his thoughts until sleep was impossible. By dawn, 3 men were missing. No signs of struggle, no blood, only their rifles left behind in the snow. Sergeant Petrov called for reinforcements, but the radio emitted only static. It was as if the forgotten trenches had severed them from the rest of the world. Petrov ordered the remaining men to hold their positions, his voice trembling as he delivered what felt more like a death sentence than a command. Elias stared at the horizon, where the sun refused to rise, and felt the undeniable truth sink into his bones. They were not alone, and whatever shared the trenches with them was not bound by the laws of man. The fourth night in the forgotten trenches brought a deeper darkness, as if the earth itself had conspired to extinguish all light. Even the moon, once a faint companion in the starless sky, refused to rise above the horizon. The cold seemed alive, creeping into the soldiers' bones, its bite sharper than any blade. The men huddled in silence, their faces gaunt and eyes hollow, each lost in a private battle against the terror that had become their unrelenting enemy. Elias Kostov could feel the weight of his own breath, the rasp of it loud in his ears as he sat with his rifle cradled against his chest. He hadn't slept since the whispers began, and his nerves were frayed to the point of snapping. Every sound, every shift in the shadows felt like the prelude to something terrible. The absence of Sergeant Petrov, who had gone to investigate the perimeter an hour earlier and hadn't returned, only deepened the squad's despair. "Do you hear it?" whispered Corporal Andreev, his voice brittle and raw. Elias turned to him, startled. Andreev's eyes darted around the trench, wild and unfocused. "They're marching. I can hear them marching." No one responded, but Elias strained his ears. At first, there was only the oppressive silence. Then he heard it, faint rhythmic thuds like boots striking frozen ground. The sound seemed to echo from every direction, impossibly distant yet unervingly close. Markov, the youngest of the group, clutched his helmet as if it could shield him from the encroaching madness. "It's not real," he muttered over and over. "It's not real." But Elias knew better. He had heard the marching before, on the nights when the voices whispered his name. Now, they were growing louder, more insistent, as if whatever haunted the trenches was drawing closer with each passing moment. The tension snapped when a figure stumbled into view at the far end of the trench. It was Petrov, but something was wrong. His gait was uneven, his movements jerky, as if he were being pulled forward by unseen strings. His face, illuminated briefly by the flicker of a dying lantern, was ashen and lifeless, his eyes dark, pits devoid of recognition. The men froze, their breaths caught in their throats. "Sergeant?" Elias called out hesitantly. Petrov didn't answer. Instead, he raised his arm and pointed toward the sky. All eyes followed his gesture, and what they saw turned their blood to ice. The stars, once a faint reminder of a world beyond the trenches, had been replaced by swirling black shapes that writhed and pulsed like living shadows. The shapes moved in patterns that defied logic, forming grotesque symbols that mirrored the carvings Markov had uncovered earlier. The air grew heavy, pressing down on the men with an almost physical force. Without warning, Petrov collapsed to his knees, his body convulsing violently. The men rushed to his side, but before they could reach him, he began to speak in a voice that wasn't his own. The words poured out in a guttural, otherworldly tone, a language that clawed at their minds and twisted their thoughts. Elias clamped his hands over his ears, but it was no use. The words were inside him, searing themselves into his consciousness. As suddenly as it began, the convulsion stopped. Petrov's body went limp, and for a moment there was silence. Then the ground beneath their feet began to tremble. Dirt cascaded from the trench walls as the earth seemed to pulse with a malevolent energy. The rhythmic thuds of the marching grew deafening, and the shadows above twisted into a massive, writhing form that loomed over the trench like a nightmare given shape. Elias scrambled back, his heart hammering in his chest. The figure in the sky seemed to look directly at him, though it had no eyes. A deep, resonant voice echoed in his mind, speaking a single word: remember. It wasn't a command. It was a warning. Before he could react, a blinding light engulfed the trench, and everything went still. When Elias regained consciousness, the trench was empty. Petrov's body was gone, as were Andreev and Markov. Only Elias remained, surrounded by an unnatural silence that pressed against his ears. He stumbled to his feet, disoriented and alone. The air was heavy with the scent of burning earth, and the carvings on the trench walls seemed to glow faintly, as if mocking him. Elias didn't know how long he stood there, staring at the desolation around him. The forgotten trenches had claimed the others, and he knew it was only a matter of time before they came for him too. But as he looked up at the swirling darkness above, he felt a flicker of defiance ignite within him. Whatever was out there, whatever malevolent force had ensnared them, he vowed to uncover the truth, even if it meant facing the horrors that lay ahead. Elias trudged through the snow-covered trench, his mind racing as he tried to make sense of what had happened. The silence surrounding him was deafening, a thick and impenetrable void that seemed to stretch into eternity. Each step felt heavier than the last, as if the ground itself resisted his movements. His breath emerged in ragged clouds, his body trembling more from dread than from the biting cold. The trench, once teeming with the nervous energy of his comrades, now felt like a crypt, the air thick with the weight of unseen eyes. He paused at a bend in the trench and pressed his back against the frozen wall, gripping his rifle tightly. The weapon felt useless in his hands, a relic of a war that seemed trivial compared to the nightmare unfolding around him. He tried to focus on the sound of his breathing, to ground himself in something tangible, but even that seemed distant and hollow. Somewhere ahead, the trench split into two paths. Elias stared at the fork, indecision gnawing at his resolve. Both routes were equally ominous, their ends obscured by darkness. As he hesitated, a faint sound reached his ears, a low, mournful hum that seemed to rise from the earth itself. It was faint at first, barely audible over the pounding of his heart, but it grew steadily louder, filling the trench with its eerie resonance. Elias gritted his teeth and forced himself to move, choosing the left path. The hum followed him, growing more distinct with each step. It wasn't random noise. It was a melody, slow and deliberate, like a dirge sung by unseen mourners. The trench walls began to change as he walked. The frozen mud gave way to something else, smooth, dark stone that glistened as if wet. Strange symbols, similar to the ones Markov had uncovered, were etched into the surface, their patterns twisting and writhing when viewed from the corner of his eye. The air grew warmer, thick with the scent of decay and sulfur. Elias wiped the sweat from his brow, his unease mounting with every step. It felt as though he was descending into the bowels of the earth, leaving behind any semblance of the world he once knew. Ahead, a faint glow illuminated the trench, casting flickering shadows against the walls. Elias slowed his pace, his instincts screaming at him to turn back. But he couldn't. Something compelled him forward, a force stronger than fear or logic. As he rounded the next corner, he froze. The glow came from a pit that had been carved into the trench floor, its edges lined with jagged, uneven stones. The light emanated from the pit itself, a pulsating red that seemed alive. Shadows danced across the walls, their movements chaotic and violent, as if they fought to escape the confines of the light. Elias approached the edge of the pit cautiously, his steps hesitant. The hum was deafening now, vibrating through his body and threatening to unhinge his mind. He peered into the pit and immediately wished he hadn't. The void below seemed endless, its depths filled with writhing forms that defied comprehension. They were not human, nor animal, but something else entirely, shifting, amorphous shapes that exuded malice. They moved with purpose, their grotesque forms twisting and colliding in a grotesque symphony of chaos. He stumbled back, his heart racing, but before he could retreat further, a voice filled his mind. It was deep and resonant, reverberating through every fiber of his being. "You were chosen." The words carried a weight that crushed his thoughts, leaving him gasping for air. "You must remember. You must witness." Elias dropped to his knees, clutching his head as the voice continued. Images flooded his mind, scenes of ancient rituals, blood-soaked altars, and a towering figure cloaked in shadow. He saw soldiers, like himself, bound and screaming as they were offered to something that existed beyond the veil of reality. He He saw the forgotten trenches as they were long before the war, a place of sacrifice and despair, where the line between the living and the dead had been shattered. The images stopped as abruptly as they had begun, leaving Elias trembling and disoriented. The voice receded, but its presence lingered, a dark stain on his soul. He staggered to his feet, his legs weak and unsteady. The pit remained, its glow now dimmer, but no less menacing. He turned away, desperate to put distance between himself and the horrors he had witnessed. As he moved back through the trench, the hum began to fade, replaced by another sound, footsteps. They were uneven, dragging, and growing louder. Elias tightened his grip on his rifle, his pulse quickening. He spun around to face the source of the sound, but the trench behind him was empty. The footsteps continued, now echoing from all directions, surrounding him. Panic set in as he backed away, his eyes darting frantically in search of an escape. Then he saw them, figures emerging from the shadows, their forms shrouded in darkness. They moved slowly, their movements unnatural and jerky. Their eyes glowed faintly, twin points of light that pierced the gloom. Elias raised his rifle, his hands shaking, but he knew it was futile. The figures stopped a few feet away, their presence oppressive and overwhelming. One of them stepped forward, its features becoming clearer in the dim light. It was Petrov, or what remained of him. His face was a mask of anguish, his eyes vacant yet full of torment. His lips moved, forming words that Elias could barely hear. "You cannot run," he rasped, his voice hollow and distant. "You must remember." Before Elias could respond, the figures surged forward, their shadows consuming him. Darkness enveloped him completely, and the trench vanished. For a moment, there was nothing, no sound, no light, no time. Then, a faint hum began again, pulling him deeper into the nightmare. Elias awoke to silence, a suffocating void that wrapped around him like a shroud. His eyes fluttered open, but the darkness was impenetrable. He tried to move, only to find his body unresponsive, as though the weight of the earth pressed against him. Panic surged through his veins, and he fought against the invisible restraints, his breath shallow and frantic. The memories of the trench, the pit, and the grotesque figures flooded his mind, threatening to overwhelm him. Gradually, his senses began to return. The ground beneath him was cold and damp, the air thick with the stench of mildew and rot. He reached out with trembling hands, his fingers brushing against a smooth, uneven surface. Stone. He was no longer in the trench. The realization sent a chill down his spine. The walls surrounding him were close, pressing in on all sides. He was in a tunnel, its dimensions too narrow to stand upright. Elias crawled forward, his movements slow and deliberate. The darkness seemed to pulse, alive with an unnatural rhythm that matched the beating of his heart. Every sound he made, his breathing, the scrape of his boots against the stone, echoed endlessly, as if mocking his solitude. The air grew colder with each passing moment, carrying with it a faint metallic tang that clung to the back of his throat. The tunnel twisted and turned without reason, its path winding deeper into the earth. Strange carvings adorned the walls, their intricate designs illuminated by an occasional faint, bioluminescent glow emanating from unseen sources. The symbols were similar to those he had seen in the trench, but more detailed, more deliberate. They told a story, though its meaning eluded him. A tale of worship, sacrifice, and despair. Faces contorted in agony seemed to emerge from the stone itself, their expressions frozen in perpetual torment. Elias tried to banish the images from his mind, but they lingered, each carving more grotesque than the last. His progress was slow, his every step measured and cautious. The tunnel seemed to stretch on forever, a labyrinth with no end. Just as despair threatened to consume him, a faint light appeared in the distance, a beacon in the oppressive darkness. It was dim and flickering, but it offered a glimmer of hope. He quickened his pace, his fear momentarily eclipsed by desperation. As he drew closer, the light grew brighter, revealing a cavernous chamber. The tunnel opened abruptly, and Elias stepped into the vast space, his eyes adjusting to the sudden change. The chamber was unlike anything he had ever seen. Its walls were lined with enormous, ancient pillars, each one etched with the same symbols that had haunted him. The air was heavy with the weight of history, and a faint vibration coursed through the ground, as if the earth itself breathed. At the center of the chamber stood an altar, its surface slick with what looked like dried blood. Surrounding it were objects that defied reason. Twisted sculptures of metal and bone, their forms grotesque and otherworldly. Candles flickered around the altar, their flames casting long, wavering shadows that danced across the walls. The hum he had heard in the trench was louder here, a low, resonant thrum that seemed to emanate from the very stones beneath his feet. Elias approached the altar cautiously, his instincts screaming at him to flee. But he couldn't. Something compelled him forward, a force he couldn't resist. As he neared the altar, his vision blurred, and the world seemed to shift. The chamber grew darker, the shadows deepening until they were almost tangible. The hum became a voice, deep and resonant, speaking in a language he couldn't understand. It was ancient and guttural, its cadence both mesmerizing and terrifying. Suddenly, a sharp pain lanced through his mind, and Elias dropped to his knees, clutching his head. Images assaulted him, scenes of war, death, and despair. He saw soldiers marching into the trenches, their faces gaunt and hollow. He saw the pit again, its writhing forms now clearer, their grotesque shapes reaching out to claim the living. He saw the altar, bathed in blood, surrounded by shadowy figures chanting in unison. The final image froze in his mind. A monstrous figure emerging from the pit, its form towering and incomprehensible. The vision ended as abruptly as it had begun, leaving Elias gasping for air. He staggered to his feet, his legs trembling. The chamber was silent once more, the hum gone. But something had changed. The air felt charged, heavy with an unseen presence. He turned to leave, but the tunnel he had entered through was gone, replaced by a solid wall of stone. Panic surged through him, and he searched for another way out, his movements frantic. A sound stopped him, a low, guttural growl that seemed to come from everywhere at once. It was followed by the scrape of claws against stone, growing louder with each passing moment. Elias turned toward the altar, his heart racing. From the shadows beyond, something moved, its form indistinct but massive. Its eyes glowed faintly, twin points of light that pierced the darkness. The growl grew louder, reverberating through the chamber. Elias gripped his rifle tightly, though he knew it would be useless. The creature stepped into the flickering light, its form defying logic. It was both there and not there, its edges shifting and blurring as if it existed in multiple realities at once. Its eyes locked onto Elias, and he felt an overwhelming sense of dread. The creature moved closer, its growls transforming into something that resembled words. Witness, it intoned, its voice a chorus of countless others. Elias backed away, his mind racing for an escape. But there was nowhere to go. The chamber seemed to close in around him, the walls pulsing with a life of their own. The creature loomed over him, its presence suffocating. "You cannot run," it said, its voice filling his mind. "You are part of this?" As the creature reached for him, Elias felt the world shift once more, his vision blurring and his body growing weightless. Darkness consumed him, and he fell into the abyss, the echoes of the creature's voice following him into the void. Elias woke to find himself lying on cold stone, his body aching and his mind spinning from the vivid nightmares, or memories, that had consumed him. The air around him was stifling, dense with the metallic tang of blood and something older, something that reeked of decay. He sat up slowly, every movement a battle against the crushing weight of exhaustion. The chamber he now occupied was unlike the one before. It was smaller, claustrophobic, with walls that seemed to pulse faintly, as though alive. The floor beneath him was marked with symbols, more intricate and haunting than the ones he had seen before. They spiraled outward from where he lay, forming a pattern that felt deliberate, as though he was the focal point of some ancient ritual. The symbols glowed faintly, casting eerie shadows across the walls. Despite his fear, Elias couldn't shake the sense that he had been placed here for a reason, that his presence was not a coincidence, but a necessity. A faint sound broke the silence, a whisper, soft and persistent. At first, Elias thought it was the echo of his own breathing, but the cadence was too deliberate, too alien. He turned his head, scanning the chamber, but saw no one. The whispers grew louder, filling his ears with an indecipherable language that made his skin crawl. His heart raced as he realized the voices were coming from within the walls themselves, as if the stone carried the memories of countless souls. Elias stood, his legs unsteady but determined. He needed to find a way out, to escape this nightmare before it consumed him entirely. His rifle was gone, as was his pack, leaving him with nothing but the tattered uniform on his back. As he moved toward the far end of the chamber, a faint light appeared, a doorway, barely visible against the pulsating walls. It beckoned him, a fragile promise of freedom in an unrelenting hell. He approached the doorway cautiously, each step echoing like a drumbeat in the suffocating silence. Beyond the threshold lay another tunnel, but this one was different. The walls were lined with countless bones, human and animal, their forms fused together in grotesque patterns. Skulls stared at him from the shadows, their empty sockets seeming to follow his every move. Elias swallowed hard, his resolve wavering but unbroken. Whatever lay ahead, it had to be better than the horrors he had already faced. As he walked, the whispers intensified, their voices converging into a singular, dreadful chant. The words were incomprehensible, yet they filled Elias with a growing sense of dread. He pressed on, his pace quickening, desperate to outpace the voices that seemed to close in around him. The light ahead grew brighter, illuminating the tunnel with a sickly green glow. The air grew warmer, carrying with it the acrid stench of burning flesh. Elias emerged into another chamber, larger than the first, but no less horrifying. At its center stood a massive pit, its edges lined with jagged stones. The green light emanated from the depths of the pit, casting long, flickering shadows across the room. Around the pit stood several robed figures, their faces obscured by hoods. They chanted in unison, their voices rising and falling in a rhythm that matched the throbbing of the walls. One of the figures turned, as though sensing Elias's presence. Beneath the hood was no human face, but a grotesque amalgamation of flesh and shadow, its form shifting and flickering like a dying flame. The figure raised a hand, and the chanting ceased. The silence that followed was deafening, oppressive, as though the air itself had been stolen from the chamber. "You have come," the figure intoned, its voice a hollow echo that reverberated in Elias's chest. "The witness has arrived." The other figures turned toward him, their forms equally monstrous, their glowing eyes fixed on him with a predatory intensity. Elias backed away, his instincts screaming at him to run, but his body refused to obey. The pit began to pulse, the green light growing brighter and more erratic. From its depths came a sound, a low, guttural growl that resonated in Elias's bones. The figures began to chant again, their voices rising to a fever pitch. The pit roared in response, and something began to emerge, a mass of shifting shadows and writhing tendrils, its form too vast and chaotic to comprehend. Elias fell to his knees, his mind reeling as the truth became clear. This was no mere battlefield, no ordinary war. He was caught in something far older and far darker, a conflict beyond human understanding. The figures moved toward him, their hands outstretched, their chant transforming into words he could finally understand. "You are the bridge," they said, their voices overlapping in a cacophony. "Through you, the cycle will begin anew." The tendrils reached out from the pit, wrapping around Elias with a terrifying gentleness. His screams were swallowed by the shadows, his vision fading as the green light consumed him. The last thing he saw was the monstrous form rising from the pit, its eyes filled with ancient malice. And then there was nothing. Elias opened his eyes to a desolate landscape that seemed to stretch endlessly into a gray, featureless void. The oppressive green glow was gone, replaced by an eerie twilight that bathed everything in a cold, lifeless hue. He was no longer in the subterranean chamber, yet the memory of its horrors clung to him like a shroud. His mind reeled, struggling to piece together how he had come to this place, or even what this place was. The ground beneath his boots was soft, like ash, and the air was thick with a choking dryness that made it difficult to breathe. There were no trees, no landmarks, no signs of life. Only the faint sound of the wind, carrying whispers that seemed to mock his every step. Elias staggered forward, driven by instinct rather than logic, his thoughts a chaotic jumble of fear, confusion, and a growing sense of dread. As he walked, the whispers grew louder, forming fragmented words and phrases that sounded painfully familiar. They spoke of betrayal, of sacrifice, of cycles that could not be broken. He tried to block them out, but the voices were inside him, echoing in his mind like a relentless tide. His thoughts turned to the men he had left behind, Merrick, Weiss, and the others. Were they here too, trapped in this liminal space? Or had they met a fate even worse? Elias's steps faltered as the ground beneath him began to shift. The ash swirled, forming shapes that writhed and coalesced into faint outlines of figures. At first, they were formless, mere shadows dancing in the void. But as he watched, the figures grew clearer, taking on familiar faces. He saw Merrick, his expression frozen in a grimace of terror. Weiss appeared next, his eyes hollow and accusing. Others followed, men Elias knew, men he had fought beside, each one a specter of pain and loss. He stumbled backward, his heart pounding as the shadows advanced. They reached for him with hands that dissolved into smoke, their voices merging into a singular, mournful wail. "You brought this upon us," they cried, their words cutting deeper than any blade. "You opened the door." Elias shook his head, his denial a whisper in the howling wind. He had done nothing, he told himself. He was just a soldier, following orders, trying to survive. But the voices would not relent. The ground beneath him gave way, and Elias fell, the void swallowing him whole. He landed hard on a surface that was cold and unyielding, stone, slick with some unknown substance. The air was damp, filled with a faint stench of mildew and decay. He was back in the tunnels, though this one was different. The walls were covered in carvings, their intricate patterns telling a story he could not comprehend. Elias rose to his feet, his body aching from the fall. He traced the carvings with his fingers, the rough texture grounding him in the present. The images were grotesque, figures of men and beasts locked in eternal conflict, their forms twisted and intertwined. At the center of it all was a pit, much like the one he had seen before, surrounded by robed figures. Above them loomed a monstrous entity, its form too vast to be contained within the confines of the stone. As he moved deeper into the tunnel, the carvings grew more chaotic. The figures began to blur, their shapes dissolving into abstract patterns that hurt his eyes to look at. The whispers returned, louder now, their tone urgent and insistent. They spoke of choices, of doors that could still be closed, of sacrifices that must be made. Elias clenched his fists, his frustration mounting. He didn't understand any of it. Why him? Why had he been chosen for this madness? The tunnel ended abruptly, opening into another chamber. This one was smaller, more intimate, with a single altar at its center. Upon the altar lay a book, its cover worn and blackened as though burned. The air around it shimmered faintly, as though the object radiated a heat that Elias could not feel. He approached it cautiously, his every instinct warning him to turn back, to leave this place and never look back. But something drew him forward, a compulsion he could not resist. The book opened on its own as he neared, its pages flipping wildly before settling on a single, blank page. Elias stared at it, his breath catching as words began to appear, written in a dark, viscous ink that seemed to bleed from the paper itself. "The bridge must choose," the text read, "to end the cycle or perpetuate it. Blood seals both fates." Elias's vision blurred, the room spinning as the weight of the words settled over him. The whispers rose to a deafening crescendo, and for the first time, he understood them clearly. They were not voices of malice, but of desperation. They were pleading with him, urging him to act. The choices before him were impossible to comprehend, their consequences unknowable. But he knew one thing: he could not escape this. Whatever was happening, it was far bigger than himself, and it demanded an answer. Elias stood motionless before the altar, the book's cryptic words echoing in his mind like the toll of a distant bell. The bridge must choose. He could feel the oppressive weight of expectation pressing down on him, as if the very room demanded his decision. His hands trembled, and sweat beaded on his brow despite the unearthly chill in the air. What did it mean to be the bridge? Why him? The more he questioned, the louder the whispers grew, each one layering over the last in a cacophony of indistinct cries. The chamber seemed to pulse with life, the shadows on the walls shifting and writhing as though alive. Elias wanted to scream, to rage against the impossibility of the situation, but something inside him, the soldier's instinct to endure, kept him moving forward. His fingers hovered over the book, the inked words glistening unnaturally as though they were alive. The whispers ceased abruptly, replaced by an overwhelming silence. It was as if the room itself was holding its breath, waiting. Drawing a deep breath, Elias touched the page. The moment his fingers made contact, a shock of energy surged through his body, freezing him in place. His vision blurred, and his surroundings dissolved into darkness. Images began to flash before him, scenes of war, of lives lost, of blood spilled across countless ages. He saw men and women like himself, faces twisted in anguish as they stood before the same altar. Each one reached the book, only for the vision to shatter before revealing their choice. Then came the pit. It loomed in his mind's eye, vast and endless, its surface churning with a malevolent energy. From it rose a creature of unfathomable size and shape, its presence beyond comprehension. The whispers returned, but now they were clear. "We are bound to it. We are bound to you. The cycle must end, or it will consume all." Elias's body was released from the book's grasp, and he stumbled backward, gasping for air. The whispers faded, leaving him in the suffocating silence once more. His mind raced to make sense of what he had seen. The pit, the entity, it was the source of everything. The whispers, the shadows, the horrors that plagued this cursed land. But what was his role in all this? The book's words implied he had a choice, but how could he possibly know which path to take? He turned from the altar, scanning the chamber for any clue, any guidance. The carvings on the walls seemed to shift as he looked at them, forming scenes that mirrored his own memories. He saw himself in the trenches, the mud and blood mingling as the screams of his comrades filled the air. He saw the tunnels, the green glow, the men he had lost. And then he saw something else, an image of himself standing before the pit, his arms outstretched as the entity loomed above him. Elias felt a cold, knot of dread twist in his stomach. The carvings were not just memories. They were a prophecy, a vision of what awaited him should he fail to act. The whispers had spoken of a cycle, of a choice that could end it. But what if the wrong choice only perpetuated the horror? What if he was not strong enough to break the chain? He closed his eyes, the weight of his doubt threatening to crush him. But in the silence, a single thought emerged, a memory of Merrick, his voice steady despite the fear that had gripped them all. "Sometimes, the only way out is through," he had said, his words a reminder of their shared duty. Elias clung to that memory, using it to steady himself. Whatever lay ahead, he could not falter. Not now. Gathering his resolve, Elias turned back to the book. The blank page now bore a new inscription, written in the same dark, viscous ink. "Descend." The word filled him, with a mix of terror and determination. He knew what it meant. The pit awaited him, and with it, the answers he sought. His choice could no longer be delayed. Elias tore a strip of cloth from his uniform and wrapped it around the book, sealing it tightly before tucking it under his arm. If he was to face the entity, he would need whatever power the book held. He cast one last glance at the shifting carvings, the faces of his fallen comrades urging him forward. Then, without hesitation, he stepped into the shadows, his heart pounding as the path to the pit unfolded before him. The air grew colder with every step, and the faint sound of the whispers returned, softer this time, almost mournful. Elias knew he was walking into the unknown, but he also knew there was no turning back. Whatever lay at the bottom of the pit, he would face it head-on. For himself, for the men he had lost, and for the world that hung in the balance. The descent was marked by a silence, so profound it seemed to consume even Elias's thoughts. The narrow staircase spiraled into the earth, its stone steps slick with moisture and age. Each step felt like a small betrayal of his instincts, the primal urge to flee warring against the soldier's resolve to press on. The faint green glow that had haunted the tunnels above was absent here, replaced by a dull luminescence emanating from the walls themselves. It was as though the stones were alive, pulsing faintly with each beat of Elias's heart. As he descended further, the air grew thicker, weighted with an oppressive humidity that clung to his skin and made breathing laborious. The whispers, ever present and insistent, grew louder. But now they carried a strange rhythm, a cadence that mirrored the beating of a drum. Elias couldn't decipher the words, but he felt their intent. They weren't guiding him. They were warning him. The staircase ended abruptly, depositing him into a cavern so vast that its edges were lost to shadow. The faint glow from the walls illuminated a path of jagged stone, leading toward a central platform suspended above an abyss. Elias's gaze was drawn inexorably downward, to the pit that yawned open like a hungry maw. Its surface writhed and churned, an impossible mix of darkness and light that seemed to defy the very nature of reality. From the depths of the pit came a sound, a deep, resonant hum that vibrated through Elias's body, setting his teeth on edge. It wasn't mechanical, nor was it organic. It was something entirely alien, a sound that didn't belong in this world. As he stepped onto the platform, he felt the weight of countless eyes upon him. Yet when he turned, the cavern remained empty, its oppressive silence broken only by the hum from below. On the platform stood a pedestal, carved from the same stone as the altar above. Resting atop it was a dagger, its blade a translucent obsidian that shimmered unnaturally in the dim light. The whispers grew frantic, overlapping and colliding in a chaotic chorus. Elias reached for the dagger, but the moment his fingers brushed its hilt, he was overwhelmed by a surge of memories that weren't his own. He saw the pit as it had once been, a source of power revered by an ancient civilization. They had drawn from its energy, bending it to their will, creating marvels that defied explanation. But their arrogance had been their undoing. The pit was not a wellspring of life. It was a prison, holding something vast and malevolent at bay. In their greed, they had weakened the bindings, and the entity within had begun to seep into their world, corrupting and consuming all it touched. The vision shifted, showing Elias the aftermath of their hubris. The civilization was gone, reduced to ash and ruin, its secrets buried deep beneath the earth. The whispers, he realized, were not the voices of the pit. They were the echoes of those who had tried to contain it. Their warnings had been ignored, their sacrifices forgotten. Now the cycle threatened to repeat. Elias stumbled back, the dagger clutched tightly in his hand. The whispers fell silent once more, leaving him alone with his thoughts. He understood now why he had been brought here. The pit was not a battlefield. It was a choice. To seal it would require a sacrifice, a price that could not be undone. Yet to leave it unsealed would mean unleashing a horror beyond comprehension upon the world. His thoughts turned to Merrick, to the men who had followed him into the tunnels, to the lives lost in this unending war. What was one more sacrifice in the face of so much death? And yet, the weight of the decision felt unbearable. He was no hero, no chosen savior. He was just a soldier, a man trying to survive in a world that had long since forgotten mercy. The hum from the pit grew louder, resonating with a terrible urgency. Elias stepped to the edge of the platform, peering into the abyss. The entity stirred, its form just visible beneath the roiling surface. It was waiting. For him. For his decision. He gripped the dagger tighter, the obsidian blade cutting into his palm and drawing blood. The pain grounded him, reminded him of his humanity. He had a choice to make, and whatever path he chose, there would be no turning back. With a final, steadying breath, Elias raised the dagger, the whispers rising in a crescendo around him. The platform trembled beneath his feet, the pit reacting to his intent. The entity loomed larger, its form pressing against the boundaries of its prison. Elias closed his eyes, his mind racing with the weight of all he had seen, all he had learned. In the end, he realized the choice was not about the past or the future. It was about the present, the courage to act, the willingness to face the unknown. And then, with a single, decisive motion, Elias made his choice. Elias's arm hung in the air, the dagger trembling in his grasp as the whispers reached a fever pitch. The platform beneath him quaked violently, threatening to send him plummeting into the pit's writhing abyss. His body was frozen, locked in a battle between instinct and resolve. The obsidian blade seemed to hum with its own resonance, vibrating against his palm as if alive, eager for its purpose to be fulfilled. Just as he steeled himself to drive the dagger downward, the cavern erupted in light. A beam of pale green shot upward from the pit, enveloping him and throwing his shadow grotesquely across the walls. It was blinding and otherworldly, a brilliance that carried with it no warmth, only cold, seeping dread. Elias staggered backward, clutching his eyes, the whispers falling silent for the first time since he had entered the labyrinth. When he opened his eyes, he found himself no longer in the cavern, but standing in a field of ash. The sky was an ashen gray, and the ground was littered with skeletal remains of trees, their gnarled branches reaching skyward as if pleading for salvation. Elias felt no wind, no life, just an oppressive stillness that pressed against him like a physical weight. He was not alone. Before him stood a figure, cloaked in a black robe that rippled unnaturally as though moved by unseen currents. Its face was obscured, but two faint pinpricks of light glowed where eyes might have been. The figure exuded an aura of malevolence, so potent it made Elias's knees buckle. Yet it did not move closer. Instead, it spoke, its voice resonating directly within Elias's mind, a deep, sonorous tone that carried the weight of eons. "Do you understand what you hold?" The entity intoned, its presence towering despite its stillness. Elias tightened his grip on the dagger instinctively. "A weapon to seal the pit," he said, though his voice trembled with uncertainty. The figure let out a sound that could have been laughter or something far more sinister. "A key, not a weapon. A key to a door you do not comprehend. A lock forged by those who feared what they could not control." Elias felt his breath catch. "The pit, it's not just a prison," he said, piecing together fragments of what he'd seen in the visions. "It's something else, isn't it?" The figure inclined its head ever so slightly, as if pleased. "The pit is a boundary, a threshold. What lies within is not meant for mortal understanding. Yet those who came before you tried to harness it, and their arrogance consumed them." Elias took a step forward, his fear replaced by a rising anger. If it's so dangerous, why does it exist at all? Why not destroy it? The figure's lights flickered, its voice tinged with something resembling sorrow. To destroy would mean to destroy the balance. Your world exists not in spite of this darkness, but because of it. Every act of creation must cast a shadow, and this is that shadow made manifest. The word struck Elias like a physical blow. He realized then that the pit wasn't simply a threat, it was a necessity. But its presence in this world was unstable, unnatural. The SEALs were failing because the balance had already been disrupted. By the war, by humanity's insatiable hunger for power, by forces he could scarcely begin to understand. Then what am I supposed to do? Elias asked, his voice breaking. If sealing it isn't the answer, what is? The figure extended a hand, skeletal fingers reaching toward him. The choice remains yours, as it was for those before you. You can seal the pit, delaying the inevitable, or you can open it fully and accept the consequences of what comes. Either way, your world will change. The dagger pulsed in his grip, the obsidian blade growing warm against his palm. Elias looked down at it, the weight of its purpose almost too much to bear. The whispers returned, softer now, as though urging him to listen rather than act. He looked back at the figure, but it was gone, the ash-filled field dissolving around him like smoke in the wind. Elias awoke on the platform, the dagger still in his hand. The pit below churned more violently than before, the entity within stirring, aware of his hesitation. He could feel the cavern collapsing around him, the walls trembling as the choice loomed before him. With time running out, Elias knew one thing for certain. Whatever decision he made, the world would never be the same. And with that realization, he raised the dagger once more. The dagger felt heavier than before, as if the weight of the world had been transferred into its obsidian blade. Elias stood at the edge of the platform, looking down into the abyss. The whispers were now a steady, rhythmic hum, like the beat of a war drum, reassuring yet ominous. He had made his choice, or at least he thought he had, but the uncertainty lingered like a fog, clouding his thoughts and inhibiting his actions. The air around him felt charged, thick with tension, as if the very fabric of reality was being stretched to its limits. The light from the pit seemed to warp, bending and distorting in ways that defied logic, creating a kaleidoscope of colors and shadows that flickered with the intensity of an impending storm. The entity that had spoken to him was still there, lurking beneath the surface of his mind. Its presence felt even though it had vanished from his sight. Its cryptic words echoed relentlessly, reverberating through his consciousness. Your world will change. Elias's mind raced, trying to comprehend the enormity of what he was facing. He had always believed in clear lines, right and wrong, good and evil, life and death. But now, all those boundaries seemed fluid, as if the very nature of existence had become a puzzle with missing pieces. What if there was no choice at all? What if everything he had been told, everything he had believed, was merely a distortion of something far greater and far darker than he could ever understand? He glanced at the dagger once more, its dark surface shimmering in the eerie light. He could sense the power within it, a latent force that seemed to hum with a life of its own. But more than its power, he felt a deep, almost primal fear. The fear of what might happen if he truly understood the nature of what lay beneath the pit, the reality that the figure had hinted at but never fully explained. Taking a deep breath, Elias steeled himself. He couldn't turn back now, not with so many lives hanging in the balance. He had seen the consequences of inaction, the glimpses of war and destruction that would spread across the world if the pit were left open. But was sealing it truly the answer? Was there another way? What if the war, the suffering, the bloodshed that had gripped the world was somehow connected to this very place? The hum from the pit intensified, now accompanied by an unsettling vibration that resonated through the ground beneath him. It was as if the earth itself was protesting, unwilling to accept whatever decision he was about to make. The whispers returned, though this time they were not disembodied voices. They were his own thoughts, playing out in a loop, over and over, each one feeding into the next. What if you fail? What if you destroy everything? What if this is all a test? What if? The thoughts spiraled into a whirlpool of uncertainty. Elias gripped the dagger tighter, trying to push the voices away, but they only grew louder, more insistent. He could feel the ground beneath him shifting, the platform swaying as though it were on the verge of crumbling. The pit seemed to call to him, not in a voice, but in a sensation that seeped into his very bones. A call to let go, to surrender, to release whatever remained of his humanity. He was no longer sure what he was holding. Was it a weapon, a key, or something else entirely? Had he ever been in control of the situation, or had he merely been a pawn in a much larger game? The fear that had first gripped him now surged into something darker, a feeling of vertigo as though the world itself was beginning to unravel. Suddenly, the pit itself seemed to respond to his hesitation. The lights within it flickered and shifted, the colors swirling violently, and then, with an earth-shattering crack, the cavern began to shake. Elias stumbled, his knees buckling as the platform swayed dangerously. The pit's hum became a deafening roar, reverberating through his skull, shaking him to his core. He dropped to his knees, clutching his head in agony. And then, in a moment of clarity amid the chaos, Elias realized something. The pit was not merely a physical space. It was a tear in the fabric of reality itself. It was a wound, a rift that had been forced open long ago, and it was now bleeding into the world. The whispers, the visions, the very essence of the entity beneath. It was all a manifestation of the rupture between worlds. For the first time, Elias understood. He wasn't here to make a choice between sealing the pit or unleashing it. The real choice lay in understanding what the pit represented. The collapse of boundaries, the dissolution of everything he had ever known. To act, to make a decision, was to accelerate or halt that collapse. He wasn't the savior of this world. He was the last thread holding the fabric of reality together. As the ground beneath him cracked open, Elias made his decision. It was no longer a matter of saving or condemning the world. It was a matter of survival. The dagger was not a weapon. It was a symbol, a tool meant to restore balance, to mend the tear, to preserve the integrity of existence. He raised it high, not to strike the pit, but to pierce through the boundaries between worlds, to stitch the tear closed. And in that moment, as the dagger descended, the world as he knew it began to unravel. The instant the dagger pierced the air, something unimaginable happened. A surge of energy radiated outward, not from the blade itself, but from the very fabric of existence that Elias had tried so desperately to preserve. The vibrations in the cavern became deafening, as though the world itself was gasping for breath, caught in the throes of some unfathomable transformation. Elias felt his body strain against an invisible force, the energy pulling him, pushing him, stretching him in ways that defied the laws of nature. For a moment, everything went black, and then a piercing light erupted from the center of the pit, so bright it consumed everything. The edges of Elias's vision blurred, his mind struggling to comprehend what was happening. He had expected a shockwave, an explosion of sorts, but this was something else entirely. It was as if the very air around him had been replaced by an overwhelming flood of light, filling every inch of the cavern, consuming all darkness. And then, just as quickly, the light began to recede, leaving behind a silence so profound that it felt as though the universe itself had exhaled, holding its breath. Elias blinked, trying to clear his head. The cavern was gone. In its place, there was only an endless void, stretching out in every direction. He was floating suspended in some kind of liminal space, a place between reality and the unknown. There was no ground beneath his feet, no wall surrounding him, just an infinite expanse of nothingness. Yet somehow, he wasn't alone. The figure appeared again, as it had before. It was no longer cloaked, and its form was now clearly visible, an entity that was both human and not, an amalgamation of light and shadow, its face a swirling mass of shifting features. Its eyes, glowing faintly with an unnatural light, fixed upon Elias with an intensity that felt like it was probing his very soul. "You have done it." The entity's voice resonated, not with sound, but with a presence that filled every corner of the void. "You have sealed the wound, but not in the way you think." Elias opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. The figure seemed to understand, nodding as though it had expected this. "You thought the dagger was the key," the figure continued, "but it was merely a symbol, a manifestation of your will. You believed you could restore balance by binding the tear, but the tear is not a physical thing. It is a crack in perception, a fissure in how you understand your reality. What you did, what you really did, was far more dangerous. The air around Elias seemed to thrum with this revelation, and the weight of the figure's words began to sink in. He had thought he was mending the rift between worlds, repairing a cosmic wound that had been inflicted long ago. But now, as he stood suspended in this void, he realized the truth. There was no repairing this. The tear had never been a simple wound. It was a rupture in the very nature of existence itself. It wasn't something that could be fixed, not by a dagger or any other mortal means. The figure's eyes bored into Elias's, and he felt his sense of self begin to unravel, as though his very thoughts were being pulled apart. The balance was never what you thought it was, the figure whispered, its voice now barely a murmur, like the wind in the branches of a dead tree. You have not stopped the collapse. You have accelerated it. As these words echoed in the void, Elias felt the pull of the abyss around him grow stronger, tugging at his very essence. The ground beneath him had never existed, but now he felt as though the very air was shifting, warping into something unrecognizable. Time seemed to lose all meaning, stretching and folding upon itself, until past, present, and future became indistinguishable. The fabric of reality was no longer a solid thing. It was now a fluid, elastic state, like a dream that was slipping through his fingers, dissolving before his eyes. Suddenly, the silence was broken by the sound of something familiar voices. They were distant, fragmented, but unmistakably human. He heard the echoes of people, soldiers, civilians, family, friends, all speaking in a language he couldn't quite understand. The voices swirled around him, growing louder, more insistent, as though they were reaching out to him from some distant, unreachable place. Elias tried to speak, to reach out to them, but his voice was drowned in the overwhelming tide of sound. And then, just as suddenly, the voices stopped. A new presence manifested before him, one far darker and more unsettling than the figure that had first appeared. This presence was not a being. It was an absence, a void that consumed all light and sound in its wake. It stood at the edge of the nothingness, its form nothing more than a shadow, a suggestion of something ancient and incomprehensible. You have brought them, the presence intoned, its voice a cold, oppressive force that seemed to twist the very air. The ones who should have remained beyond the veil. The ones who never should have known. Elias felt his heart race, the terror now tangible in the air around him. He couldn't see what the presence referred to, but he felt the weight of it. He felt the presence of those long lost, the forgotten souls of history, all now standing in the same void, trapped between worlds because of his actions. They were here because of him. I didn't know, Elias whispered, his voice breaking. I didn't understand. The presence didn't respond, but Elias felt a ripple of something, a sense of something irrevocable having been set into motion. The collapse was inevitable now, but what would come of it? Would everything he knew be torn apart, or would something else emerge in its place? Was this the price of meddling with forces beyond human comprehension? As Elias stood alone in the void, the question remained unanswered. The disorienting experience that Elias had endured in the void had left him more fractured than ever. When he had finally regained some semblance of consciousness, the world around him was no longer as it had been. The firmament of reality, once so predictable, now seemed to have unraveled. Elias stood, no longer certain of his place in the world, his mind a labyrinth of thoughts that echoed with uncertainty. The knowledge that he had somehow become both the catalyst and the victim of this unraveling weighed heavily on him. The presence, the shadow that had appeared in the void, had left its mark, lingering in the back of his mind. The void itself had not vanished. It had instead condensed, taking on a form that was even more inexplicable. Elias could still sense the gap between what he thought he knew and what had truly happened. Every aspect of the environment around him now seemed hollow, as though the world was a mere facade, a construction meant to deceive the senses. A single step forward seemed impossible, as though the space he inhabited was not truly real. The questions that had plagued him before had only deepened in the aftermath. Was this new, strange place the result of his actions? Or had he crossed into something much darker, something that had always existed in the background, just beyond his reach? It became apparent that the things Elias had once relied on, structure, logic, the predictability of time, were no longer meaningful. In this space, these pillars had no weight. It was as if they had been swept away, their foundation turned to dust, replaced by a kind of silence that filled the air. The silence was not peaceful or serene. It was a haunting absence, as though the world had been robbed of its voice, the cacophony of existence itself stilled. Elias struggled to regain his focus, but the oppressive quiet seemed to push in on him from all sides. Even his thoughts began to feel distant, as though they were echoes in a cavern too vast to comprehend. His memories flickered erratically, never fully coalescing. Faces and names, once so clear, now blended into a haze of confusion. He couldn't remember when or how he had come to this place, but the sense of isolation was overwhelming. The connection to his past had been severed, and he was left with nothing but a gnawing uncertainty. And then, just as suddenly as the silence had settled, it was broken by the sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate. Elias spun around, heart racing, expecting to find the source of the sound. But there was nothing there, nothing visible. His pulse quickened as the footsteps continued, each step echoing in the vast emptiness. It was as though the footsteps were walking toward him, yet he couldn't see anyone. The sensation was maddening, the dissonance between sound and vision pulling at his sanity. His mind screamed for clarity, but nothing made sense. The footsteps, so simple, so familiar, became a constant presence in the space, and Elias could no longer tell if they were real or an illusion brought on by his fractured mind. Despite the unrelenting footsteps, Elias felt no desire to flee. There was a strange compulsion, a quiet insistence, urging him to remain still. The world had become an alien landscape, and running through it would lead him nowhere. The steps circled around him, drawing closer and closer, but the source remained unseen. The sense of dread that had accompanied the silence began to shift into something else. It was not fear, but rather the unsettling sensation of being watched, of being scrutinized by some unseen force. The footsteps were no longer merely noise. They were deliberate. They were observing him, testing him, perhaps even judging him. The realization hit him all at once. He was not alone in this space. The emptiness he had assumed was complete was merely a facade. Beneath it, something or someone was watching, waiting for him to respond. Elias couldn't help but feel like an object in a grand, unfathomable experiment. He was the subject, but he had no idea who the observer was or what the nature of this experiment truly was. Was he being tested for his guilt in the events that had unfolded? Or was it something deeper, something that transcended his own actions and into the realm of the unknowable? The footsteps stopped. It was as though the very air had held its breath. And then, from the distance, too far to be within reach, yet too close to be ignored, a voice echoed. It was calm, even serene, yet it carried a weight that seemed to settle upon Elias's chest, constricting his breath. The price of knowledge is never truly understood until it is paid, the voice intoned. It was neither warm nor cold, just a calm acceptance of the truth it spoke. You have seen the truth, but truth comes at a cost. The voice did not belong to any person Elias could remember. It was not the figure from the void or the oppressive presence that had followed him. It was something more ancient, a presence that felt woven into the very fabric of reality itself. It spoke not to Elias as an individual, but as a part of something far greater, something that had always been and always would be. The silence that followed felt like the deepest abyss. You did not ask the right questions, the voice continued. Now, you will witness the answer. Elias wanted to scream, but the words caught in his throat. He could feel the void pressing in around him, the edges of his thoughts curling like smoke, slipping through his fingers. His grip on himself, on his own reality, was slipping away, The world he had known was collapsing further into the unknown, into the silence that had now claimed all sense of certainty. And in that moment, Elias realized what had truly happened. The world around him was not simply broken. It had always been fragile, a thin veil stretched across the depths of something far darker, something that had never fully been hidden from view. He had seen the tear. He had touched the edges of it. And now, there was no going back. There was no way to undo what had been done. The truth, once known, could never be unlearned. The answers he had sought had cost him his place in the world, and perhaps his very understanding of what it meant to exist. The footsteps began again. Only this time, they were not alone. The silence had shattered entirely, and Elias could hear countless others, walking with purpose. The world, as he had once known it, was gone. It had slipped through his fingers like water, and all that remained was the cold, indifferent march of something far older than himself. Elias had become a witness, not to the world, but to its collapse. And as the footsteps drew near, he could not help but wonder if this was the beginning of something far darker than he had ever imagined. The world Elias had known seemed irreparably fractured. The once familiar geography of his mind and the physical landscape had dissolved into a labyrinth of disjointed fragments, each more perplexing than the last. Time in particular no longer adhered to any linearity. Days and nights blended into an eternal twilight, and the passage of hours became irrelevant in the wake of his unrelenting confrontation with this strange, ever-shifting space. It was as if the fabric of reality itself had been torn, and in its place existed something infinitely more elusive, a moment that hovered at the edge of understanding, impossible to pin down. Elias's every step seemed to carry him further from the comforting illusion of normalcy he had clung to. The footsteps that had once circled him in the silence had become a constant presence, yet they were not a source of immediate fear anymore. It was not terror that Elias felt as they drew near. It was resignation. The strange voice from before had planted a seed within him, a truth he could not unhear. Knowledge had come at a price. And that price was not simply a loss of his former world, but of his very perception of what was real. This fragmented reality was not merely an absence of certainty. It was an active, invasive force that sought to unmake everything he had ever understood. The rules that governed his life, the rules he had once relied upon to navigate the complexities of existence, were no longer applicable. This new space, or whatever it was defined by an endless flux, a chaotic ebb and flow that resisted any effort to impose structure. The more Elias tried to ground himself, to make sense of the disjointed elements around him, the further he slipped into uncertainty. At times, he thought he glimpsed things that shouldn't be there, shadows that stretched in unnatural directions, flashes of light that dissolved into nothingness. And yet, he could not discern whether these were real or simply figments of his own deteriorating mind. His vision blurred constantly, as though he were looking through water, and the edges of objects seemed to ripple as though they existed in multiple dimensions at once. He found it difficult to focus on anything for long, as if each new perception invited another layer of confusion. The footsteps remained a constant rhythm, soft, deliberate, and omnipresent. At times, they seemed to echo from every direction, and at others, they came from far away. There was no apparent pattern to their movement, no way to predict their arrival. Elias realized, with growing unease, that the footsteps were not just random sounds. They were leading him, as though drawing him towards some unknown destination, some revelation that was just out of reach. And then, amidst the endless noise of his fractured thoughts, a new sensation crept into Elias's mind, the feeling of being observed, not just by the footsteps, but by something far greater, something pervasive. It was as though the very walls of the universe were watching him, silent, all-knowing, and indifferent. The weight of this unseen gaze pressed upon him, suffocating him in its omnipresence. It was a presence that did not feel human, nor was it bound by any sense of time or space. In the absence of clarity, Elias's mind began to grasp at anything familiar, any sliver of his former self. He thought of his life before the descent into this realm, the life he had once known, with its struggles, triumphs, and failures. But these memories, too, were slipping away from him, becoming more like dreams that faded with the morning light. He had once been a man with purpose, driven by a need to understand the world and his place in it. Now, even that sense of purpose seemed increasingly irrelevant. What was the point of understanding when the world itself had betrayed the very idea of understanding? Elias could no longer be certain of where he was, or even when he was. The space around him had begun to blur, as though he were caught in some kind of purgatory, a waiting room suspended between one existence and the next. There were no clear markers of reality anymore, no definitive sense of self or place. He had become something like a witness to his own undoing, standing on the precipice of a world that no longer obeyed any of the laws he had once known. It was as though he were adrift on an ocean of broken pieces, each fragment of reality lost in the infinite expanse. He stumbled forward, no longer walking with purpose, but simply reacting to the rhythm of his existence. Each step felt as though it were dragging him closer to the inevitable conclusion of this strange, fractured journey. The footsteps that had once been a mystery now seemed less like an ominous presence and more like a guide, drawing him closer to something that might reveal the truth, or perhaps deepen the mystery even further. In the distance, Elias could see a faint glimmer of light, so distant that he thought it was a trick of his vision. Yet, as he moved closer, the light grew brighter, more tangible. It felt like a beacon, and with each step toward it, the oppressive silence seemed to lift just slightly. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, Elias could hear his own breathing, shallow and erratic, but undeniably real. As he neared the light, something shifted in the air, a subtle change, but one that Elias could not ignore. It was as though the very atmosphere had become charged, vibrating with some unseen force. He felt a tingling sensation on his skin, and his hair stood on end. The light, though faint, seemed to call to him, and the closer he got, the more his mind became clouded with a sense of urgency. It was as if the light were a promise that could end this strange limbo, a promise of answers, or perhaps of something even worse. He reached out his hand toward the light, and as his fingers touched the edge of its radiance, everything within him stilled. The world around him seemed to pause, and for the briefest of moments, Elias felt as though he were suspended between two realities. The fractured world, with all its distortions, seemed to hold its breath, as if waiting for him to make a choice, to step forward into the unknown or to retreat back into the madness from which he had come. In that moment, Elias realized that the fracture he had felt was not just within the world around him. It was within himself. He was no longer simply a victim of the events that had unfolded. He was a participant, an agent in the collapse of his own reality. And now, standing on the precipice of the light, he understood that there would be no turning back. Whatever lay ahead would change him forever. As Elias crossed the threshold of light, an unexpected chill seized him. It was not the familiar cold of a winter's night or the sharp bite of a storm's arrival. This cold seemed to sink into the very marrow of his bones, as though the light itself, far from providing warmth, had torn him from the world he had known and placed him into an existence wholly foreign to his senses. It was not a new place, at least not in any traditional sense. The landscape around him was unchanged, but something profound had shifted. He had not moved, yet everything seemed distant, foreign, as though reality itself had loosened from its fixed point and was now suspended in an unsettling dance. The familiar footsteps, those same deliberate, haunting steps that had echoed in the periphery of his mind for so long, had stopped. A suffocating silence descended. The absence of those footsteps, once a constant reminder of his pursuit, was perhaps the most unsettling development of all. For the first time since entering this fractured existence, Elias felt truly alone. There were no sounds, no distant voices, no comforting markers of his previous life. The world around him had become nothing more than a hollow shell, a stage without actors, a play without words. The light, now fully enveloping him, did not seem to emanate from any fixed source. It surrounded him from all directions, bending the space around him, warping his perception. He could no longer discern which way was up, down, left, or right. The world itself had lost its edges. It was as though he had stepped into the very heart of chaos, where order had collapsed and what remained was an empty canvas, waiting to be reshaped by forces beyond his understanding. And then, just as the disorientation was beginning to overwhelm him, something changed. A shape began to form within the light, slowly at first, like the slow unfurling of a distant memory, but with growing clarity. At first, Elias thought it was simply his mind trying to make sense of the chaos, to pull meaning from the overwhelming strangeness of a situation. But as the form became more distinct, he realized it was no figment of his imagination. It was something real, something present, standing before him, even though there was no way to determine exactly how it had come to be. The figure was humanoid in shape, yet it lacked the defining features of any human being Elias had ever seen. The contours of its body were fluid, shifting as though it were made of smoke or vapor. Its face, if it could even be called that, was a blur of shadow and light, with no discernible eyes, mouth, or any other feature that would normally provide a sense of recognition. The being was neither threatening nor comforting. It was simply there, watching him. "Who are you?" Elias found himself asking, though his voice sounded distant, as though it were emanating from a place far removed from his own body. The figure did not respond, but it began to move, slowly, almost deliberately, as though it was choosing each step carefully. Elias could not move, his body frozen in place by an invisible force. It was not pain that kept him rooted to the spot, but something more subtle, an overwhelming sensation that whatever this entity was, it held the power to unmake him, to dissolve his very existence if it wished. He stood paralyzed, caught between an irrational desire to flee and the chilling certainty that flight was impossible. As the figure drew nearer, the air around Elias seemed to grow colder, denser. It pressed against him, pushing in from all sides, yet no matter how tightly it closed around him, it didn't feel like physical space. It felt as if the very essence of his being was being squeezed, not from the outside, but from within. It was as though the figure itself was draining him of something vital, something irreplaceable. Then, in a voice that seemed to reverberate through his entire being, the figure spoke. But its words were not formed in any recognizable language. They were not sounds, nor were they vibrations that could be heard. They were thoughts that did not belong to Elias, but which suddenly appeared in his mind, foreign and yet utterly familiar. "You are a part of this," the words echoed within him. "This reality, this unraveling. You were always meant to be here." Elias recoiled inwardly. He had always believed that his arrival in this strange world, this fractured existence, had been a consequence of some cosmic mistake. He had thought of himself as a victim, someone who had stumbled into a reality not meant for him. But now, with these words resonating within him, he began to question that assumption. Had he been drawn into this place for a reason? Had he, in some way, always been a part of the process that had led to this unraveling? The thought was terrifying, but it also carried with it an undeniable weight. If he was a part of this, what did that make him? A participant? A catalyst? Or perhaps something even worse? An inevitable consequence of the collapse he had witnessed? The figure moved closer still, and for the first time, Elias realized that he could feel something, an almost imperceptible warmth, emanating from it. It was not the warmth of comfort or hope, but the warmth of something ancient and unknowable. The warmth of a force that had been at work long before he had ever arrived, long before the first cracks had appeared in the world he once knew. "You cannot return," the figure intoned, its voice now filled with an odd, resonant finality. "Not to what you once knew. That world is gone, as are all the worlds that came before it." The weight of its words sank into Elias like a stone dropped into still water. He felt an overwhelming sense of loss, as though something vital had been ripped from him, something irretrievable. The world he had once known, the world that had shaped him, was indeed gone, and there was no going back. The light around him flickered briefly, and Elias was struck with the undeniable realization that he was no longer just a passive observer. He had crossed a threshold, and now he was part of something far greater, far more complex than anything he could have ever imagined. The unraveling was not just the destruction of a world. It was the end of something much older, something that had existed long before the first stone was set, before time itself began to tick. He had been a part of it all along, whether he had known it or not. And as the figure faded into the light, its presence still lingering in his mind, Elias understood that his journey was far from over. It had only just begun. Elias had always understood the world to be something solid, something tangible, something governed by rules. The laws of nature, of physics, of time itself had always been constants in his life. But in the strange place he now found himself, these constants no longer applied. Time no longer passed in linear moments. Gravity felt like a suggestion rather than an inescapable force. The very fabric of existence had been torn apart and woven back together in ways that made no sense to his mind. It was as though the place he had entered was a liminal space, a point between worlds where nothing could be relied upon. His sense of self, his identity, his past, the person he had once been, began to dissolve like mist in the early morning light. He reached for his memories, but they slipped from his grasp, scattering in all directions like shards of broken glass. In their place, new thoughts and new images began to intrude. Thoughts that were not his own, but felt disturbingly familiar. He could no longer rely on his own perceptions, for nothing around him seemed real. The light, which had once been so oppressive, now felt like a distorted mirror, reflecting images that were not of this world. There were figures, faint, half-formed, moving just beyond his vision. Whenever he turned to look at them, they were gone, only to appear somewhere else in his periphery. These figures did not seem hostile, but they did not seem to belong either. They were phantoms, echoes of something that had once been, or perhaps something that was yet to be. The air was thick with an unspoken tension, an energy that thrummed just below the surface of his consciousness. It was as though the very essence of the space he occupied was waiting for something he couldn't yet comprehend. But the longer he stood in this strange reality, the more certain he became that he was being watched, not by the figures, not by any entity, but by the space itself. The boundaries of reality had been stretched, and now they were collapsing inward, folding upon themselves, pulling him deeper into a void that was not meant to exist. With each passing moment, Elias felt as though he was losing his grip on the world he had once known. He could no longer remember the face of his family, the sound of their voices, or even the feeling of the sun on his skin. The memory of the past had begun to slip away entirely, as though the space he was now inhabiting was erasing everything that had come before. What was left, then? What was his identity if not a collection of memories, a story told by the passage of time? Desperation clawed at him. He tried to call out for help, but the words caught in his throat, strangled by the strange atmosphere around him. It was as though sound itself had no place in this space. The silence was profound, impenetrable, a silence that made him feel utterly insignificant in the grand scheme of things. How could he be here, trapped in this fractured reality, with no one to reach out to, no way to understand what had happened? But then, amidst the disorienting silence, there came a faint noise. It was a whisper, so soft at first that Elias doubted he had heard it at all. He strained to listen, but it came again, this time clearer, though still indistinct. The words were not in any language he recognized, but they carried a sense of urgency. They were words of warning, of knowledge passed down through generations, of a world far older than anything he could grasp. Elias, you must remember, you are the key. The words echoed in his mind, reverberating against the walls of his fractured thoughts. It was then that Elias realized something important, something that had eluded him before. He had been here before, not in this exact moment, but in the patterns, in the very structure of what was happening to him. This place, this strange, bending space, had not appeared by accident. It had been waiting for him, calling him, shaping him into something more than he had ever imagined. The realization hit him like a jolt of electricity. He was not merely a victim of circumstance. He was a participant, a player in some ancient game. This place, this reality, was not random. It was not a mistake. It was a design, a carefully orchestrated event that had been set in motion long before his birth. Elias tried to piece together what this meant. His mind raced to make sense of the fragmented thoughts, the disjointed memories. But every time he thought he understood, something new, something even more incomprehensible, would emerge, pushing his understanding further out of reach. It was as if the boundaries of reality itself were shifting, bending in ways that defied explanation. But despite the confusion, Elias felt something else, a stirring deep within him. It was not just fear or anxiety, but a kind of purpose. He had been drawn here for a reason, whether he understood it or not. The whispers, the fragmented images, the strange sense of being watched, all of it was part of a larger design, a pattern that he was only beginning to glimpse. And in that moment, Elias knew that his journey was far from over. It was only just beginning. The figures that had been moving at the edges of his vision began to take form once again, more distinct this time. And in that moment, Elias understood. They were not phantoms, not mere echoes of the past. They were part of him, just as he was part of them. He had been a part of this space, this reality, long before he had ever set foot in it. The boundaries of reality had not collapsed. They had merely shifted to reveal the deeper layers of existence. And Elias, in some strange, unknowable way, was at the center of it all. The silence that had once felt so oppressive now seemed to pulse with possibility. Elias was not lost in this fractured reality. He was meant to be here. As Elias stood there, surrounded by the shifting, half-formed figures and the distorted reality that enveloped him, he began to understand something crucial. The space he occupied was not a prison but a threshold. It was a point of transformation, a passage from one state of existence to another. The fabric of his own reality had been frayed and unraveled, revealing the deeper layers of his identity, layers that had remained hidden for as long as he could remember. Yet, the more he pondered this, the more unsettled he became. He had always believed that memory was a reliable anchor, something that held the self together in the face of uncertainty. But here, that anchor had become a liability, a fragile construct at best. His memories, those images that had once defined his very essence, now felt disjointed, disconnected, as though they had been pieced together from fragments of dreams. Faces he had known, places he had lived, moments of joy and sorrow, all of them now seemed like distant echoes, faint whispers that lost their meaning with each passing second. The more he tried to grasp them, the more elusive they became. His past had begun to dissolve, not in the way a memory fades with time, but as if it had never existed in the first place. He wondered if the man he thought he was, Elias, had ever truly existed at all, or if he was simply an illusion, a fleeting image in a world where the very concept of identity had no firm foundation. But there was something deeper at work here, something that Elias could not fully comprehend yet, though it tugged at the edges of his awareness. This place, this strange, twisting reality, was not simply erasing his memories. It was rewriting them, distorting them into something new. What had once been a straight line of past experiences was now a tangled web, each thread leading to a different possibility, each choice altering the very nature of his existence. And as he stood on the edge of this unraveling tapestry, Elias could not help but feel the pull of something ancient, something far older than his memories, perhaps even older than time itself. The figures in his periphery began to take on more form now, their outlines sharper, their presence more insistent. They were no longer the phantoms he had once thought them to be. No, these figures were something else, fragments of his past, reflections of the man he had been before all of this began. Faces, gestures, conversations, all of these began to surface, but not as memories. They were like shadows of memories, distorted and warped, as though something had altered them beyond recognition. And yet, Despite their unfamiliarity, Elias could feel the unmistakable sense of recognition tugging at him. These were his own memories, but not his own at all. They were the memories of someone else, someone whose life had been intertwined with his own long before he had ever come to this place. Elias reached out to touch one of the figures, half expecting it to dissolve into thin air, as the other illusions had. But this time his fingers met something solid, something real. The figure before him, this distorted reflection of his past, seemed to pulse with an energy that resonated within him, as if it were alive, as if it were connected to something deep inside him. He could feel the weight of its gaze, as though it too were watching him, waiting for him to make sense of it all. But the more he focused on it, the more the figure began to shift and change, becoming something else entirely. The face that had once been familiar twisted into something unrecognizable, a grotesque distortion of the person it had once been. In that moment, Elias understood. This was not just a place of memory. It was a place of transformation, a liminal space where the past, present, and future converged. The boundaries between them had dissolved, leaving behind nothing but the raw essence of existence. He was not merely rediscovering his memories. He was being remade, his identity reconfigured in ways that defied understanding. The fragments of his past, those broken pieces of himself, were no longer fixed in time. They were fluid, mutable, capable of shifting and changing with each new revelation. The figures, now fully formed, began to move around him in a slow, deliberate dance. They were not attacking him, nor were they trying to communicate with him in any clear way. Instead, they seemed to be observing him, each one representing a different version of himself, a different possibility of what he could have been. Some of them smiled at him, others glared, and some simply stood in silence. Each figure seemed to hold a piece of the puzzle, a key to unlocking the true nature of the world around him. Elias felt a strange compulsion to step forward, to engage with these figures, to understand what they were trying to show him. But each time he moved, they shifted away, just out of his reach, as if they were playing some kind of game with him. The more he chased them, the further they seemed to recede, until they were nothing more than fleeting images on the edge of his perception. The space itself seemed to pulse with a rhythm, as if it were alive, as if it were responding to his every thought, every movement. It was as though the very fabric of this place was trying to communicate with him, to lead him to some hidden truth. And then, in the distance, Elias saw something that made his heart skip a beat. A doorway, barely visible against the backdrop of shifting reality, appeared before him. It was not a door in the traditional sense, but rather a shimmering portal, a rift in the air itself. It beckoned to him, pulling at him with an irresistible force. Without thinking, Elias moved toward it, his body moving in a trance-like state. The figures around him did not follow, but their gazes remained fixed on him, as if they were waiting for him to pass through the threshold. As Elias crossed the threshold, the world around him seemed to implode, collapsing inward in a blur of color and sound. The very ground beneath him seemed to dissolve, leaving him suspended in a void. But as he stepped through the portal, the strange, disorienting sensation of transformation seemed to intensify. The world he had known, the life he had lived, began to fade entirely, replaced by something else, something he could not yet comprehend. In that instant, Elias understood that his journey was far from over. He had crossed a boundary, and there was no turning back now. The figures, his past selves, had led him to this moment. And as the reality around him shifted once more, Elias felt a new sense of clarity. He was not merely a passenger in his own life. He was the architect of his own destiny. What awaited him on the other side of this portal, he could not yet say, but one thing was certain: it would change him forever. As Elias passed through the portal, the sensations of reality seemed to warp around him. He had expected to find himself in a new world, perhaps one shaped by the distorted remnants of his memories, or by the relentless reshaping of his identity. What he encountered, however, was something altogether different. A space that felt neither foreign nor familiar, but as though it was both at once. It was as if the place he stood in was caught in some timeless stasis, a moment suspended between all that had come before and all that could be. This new dimension was not a physical space in the conventional sense, nor was it a realm of mere imagination. There was no tangible floor beneath his feet or sky above his head. Instead, the air itself seemed to pulse with an ethereal presence, as though the very atmosphere was alive, breathing with him. Small, flickering lights floated in the void, their glow faint and erratic, casting long, wavering shadows. These lights resembled stars, but they did not belong to any recognizable constellation. They were a reflection of something more abstract, a chaotic interplay of memory, thought, and feeling. Elias tried to gather his bearings, but the moment he attempted to focus on his surroundings, they seemed to slip away, dissolving into indistinct patterns of color and light. The edges of his vision blurred, and with it, the certainty of his own being began to wane. It was as though this space, this threshold, had no need for him to understand its boundaries. It simply existed, a realm where the past and the future were no more than ripples in the fabric of a greater, unknowable force. For a brief moment, Elias feared he had stepped into a void of madness, a place where he would lose himself entirely. The figures, the memories, the fragments of his past, all of it seemed to dissolve into this never-ending ocean of uncertainty. But then, as his heart began to race and panic set in, something shifted. He heard a faint whisper, a soft, distant sound that seemed to originate from within the very depths of the void. It was a voice, recognizable yet unrecognizable, as though it came from a distant part of his own psyche, from a forgotten corner of his being. It spoke his name, Elias. The voice called, barely audible, but unmistakable in its urgency. "You are not alone." The words echoed through the space, reverberating in his mind. Elias instinctively turned toward the source of the voice, though he could not locate its origin. The lights flickered, and a figure began to materialize before him. It was indistinct at first, a shadow without form, but as it drew closer, the contours of a familiar face began to take shape. Elias recognized the face instantly. It was the face of the man he had once been, the version of himself he had left behind in the world he had once known. But this reflection was not quite right. There was something wrong about it, something deeply unsettling. The face before him was a distorted version of his own, aged and worn, eyes sunken deep into the skull, skin pale and drawn tight across the bones. It was the face of someone who had seen too much, someone who had lived through horrors that should have been unimaginable. And yet, there was a strange calm in the gaze of this figure. It looked at him with a quiet sadness, as though it had accepted the inevitability of its own fate. "Who are you?" Elias asked, his voice trembling with uncertainty. He felt a pull toward this figure, a desire to understand what it represented. Was it his future self? A possible version of who he could become? Or was it something else? An echo of a past long forgotten, a memory that had been buried deep within him? The figure did not answer directly, but instead reached out with one hand, gesturing for Elias to come closer. Elias hesitated, but something in the air, the strange pull of the figure's presence, compelled him to move forward. As he stepped closer, the figure's face began to shift once more, melting into a new form. It was no longer his own face, but the face of someone else entirely, a woman with dark eyes and long, flowing hair, her expression one of quiet grief. Her gaze locked onto Elias's, and for a moment, he felt as though he had known her in some distant lifetime. "Who are you?" Elias asked again, but this time his voice was softer, as if the question itself had changed in meaning. The woman's lips moved, but no sound emerged. Instead, a vision began to unfold before Elias's eyes. He saw flashes of scenes, fragments of another life. A house, long abandoned, overgrown with ivy. A child playing alone in the yard, laughing in the sunlight. And then, the sound of distant explosions, the roar of war, the smoke and ash rising into the sky. The scene shifted, and Elias saw soldiers marching, their faces cold and hard, their steps synchronized with the rhythmic beating of drums. As the images flashed before him, Elias realized that these were not just visions. They were memories, but not his own. They belonged to someone else entirely, someone whose life had been intertwined with his in ways he could not yet comprehend. He had crossed the threshold of time, and these memories, these fragments of a forgotten past, were now surfacing in his mind, begging to be understood. The woman, still silent, began to walk away, her form fading into the distance as the images continued to flash before Elias's eyes. He reached out, but she was gone, swallowed by the void that surrounded him. But the memories remained. They clung to him, wrapping themselves around his consciousness like a shroud, forcing him to relive the moments he had never experienced. Elias understood then that his journey was far from over. The past he had known was not the whole story. There were pieces of him, pieces of a life he had never lived, that remained hidden, buried beneath layers of time and distortion. These memories, these echoes of the forgotten, held the key to understanding what had happened to him and what was still to come. But he also knew that the answers would not come easily. They would not be handed to him in a neat package. He would have to seek them out, to unravel the tangled threads of his own existence, and in doing so, confront the horrors that lay hidden beneath the surface of his own being. And so, Elias moved forward, his heart heavy with the weight of the knowledge he had gained. The path ahead was unclear, but one thing was certain. The truth was waiting for him, buried deep in the forgotten past, and he would not stop until he had uncovered it all. Elias had crossed the boundary of time, or at least what he had once understood as time. The air around him was thick with the weight of forgotten memories, a constant reminder of the fractures that had marked his journey thus far. Every step he took felt like a step deeper into a labyrinth of reality itself, a twisting maze that blurred the lines between what had happened and what might be. And yet, despite the oppressive feeling that weighed on him, he couldn't help but feel an underlying pull, a quiet, insistent beckoning urging him forward. He had witnessed the shadows of another life, lived through fragments that were not his own, and encountered versions of himself he never expected to meet. Yet the deeper he ventured into this strange realm, the more he realized that the path ahead was not merely an exploration of the past or the future. It was a journey of revelation, a process of peeling back the layers of his own existence, each more distorted than the last. There was something much greater at play here, something far beyond his comprehension. The more Elias tried to grasp the truth, the more it seemed to slip through his fingers. It was during one of these fleeting moments, when his thoughts were swirling in a vortex of confusion and suspicion, that the environment around him began to shift. The lights in the void flickered again, their erratic dance creating disorienting patterns in the air. The ethereal presence that had once felt alive now seemed to be darkening, pulling into itself, coiling into something darker, heavier. Elias could feel the oppressive pressure growing stronger. It wasn't merely the shifting of the realm around him. It was as though something was watching him, something waiting just beyond his sight. The realization was sudden and jarring. Elias wasn't alone in this space. The presence that had lingered at the edges of his consciousness, that faint whisper he had heard in the past, had evolved into something more tangible. He wasn't just being observed. He was being studied, scrutinized by an intelligence that was far older and more ancient than anything he could fathom. His every movement, every thought was being monitored. His heart raced, his thoughts scrambling for answers. What was this force? Was it something malevolent? Had the figure he had seen earlier, the distorted reflection of himself, been a part of this intelligence, an extension of its will? Elias had no way of knowing, but the sudden shift in the atmosphere told him one thing. The calm he had felt earlier had been an illusion, a brief respite before the truth of his situation became clear. The realm itself seemed to warp around him, a kaleidoscope of distorted images flickering in and out of focus. His mind was assaulted by fragments of memories, some of them his own, others foreign, almost alien in their nature. The faces he had seen earlier, the woman and the soldier, began to reappear. But this time, they were not merely figments of the past. They were alive, moving in and out of his vision as if they were part of the very fabric of the space itself. Each figure seemed to carry a message, a cryptic warning of some kind, though the meaning of their words was lost in the overwhelming surge of images. Elias stumbled backward, his head spinning. He reached out for something to ground himself, but there was nothing, no anchor in this swirling void. It was as though he were drifting in a sea of his own mind, adrift in a world that had no boundaries, no rules. The fear that had been gnawing at him since his arrival here now gripped him fully. The boundaries between reality and madness had dissolved, leaving him lost in a place where time no longer held meaning. Suddenly, there was a shift, a loud, crashing sound that reverberated through the air, snapping Elias from his dazed state. His surroundings began to change once more, but this time, the shift felt different. The ground beneath his feet solidified, the air became clearer, and the disorienting lights dimmed to reveal a more familiar sight. He was no longer in the void, but instead he found himself standing in a decayed and abandoned structure. The walls were crumbling, the ceiling caved in, and the air was thick with the smell of dust and rot. It was a building he recognized. It was a place from his past, one that he had seen only in fragmented memories. A military barracks abandoned after the war. The faces from before, the woman and the soldier, now made sense. This was the place where their stories had begun, the place where the horrors that had shaped his existence had first taken root. And yet, it was also a place he had never physically been, at least not that he could remember. It was a memory so buried that it had been hidden even from his conscious mind. He moved through the building, his footsteps echoing eerily in the silence. As he ventured deeper into the structure, he could feel the presence of others, the ones who had lived here, who had fought here, who had died here. Their whispers filled the air, voices of the past that spoke of battles fought, lives lost, and promises broken. They were the ghosts of history, lingering in the corners of this place, trapped in the decaying walls of a forgotten war. As Elias explored, he felt something shift again, as though the very nature of this place was changing, adapting. He stopped in front of a rusted door, its surface marked with the scars of time. He knew, instinctively, that this was the key to understanding what had brought him here. He had been led to this moment, to this door, and now he had to face whatever lay beyond it. He hesitated for a moment, his mind racing with doubts and questions. What awaited him on the other side? Was it more memories? More fragments of a past he had never lived? Or was it something else entirely? Something that would unravel the very fabric of his existence? With a deep breath, Elias pushed the door open. The darkness beyond was suffocating, but as he stepped through, the answers he had been searching for began to reveal themselves. The door groaned as it opened, revealing a pitch-black room beyond. Elias stepped inside cautiously, feeling the air grow colder with every movement. His instincts screamed at him to turn back, to retreat from whatever lay hidden in the shadows. But he couldn't. He had come too far, and the revelations he sought were just beyond reach. In the darkness, he could almost hear the echoes of his own thoughts, a distorted reflection of his fears and doubts. The room felt alive, pulsing with a strange energy, as if it were waiting for him to make the next move. At first, there was nothing. The silence hung heavy in the air, broken only by the faintest whisper of his breath. Elias stood still, trying to make sense of the sensations flooding his mind. He had seen horrors before. He had witnessed death and despair. But this place was different. This was not merely the residue of war. It was something far darker, more primal. The room itself seemed to breathe with an unnatural force, as though it were alive, aware of his presence. As he moved deeper into the room, his eyes adjusted to the darkness, revealing faint outlines of objects scattered around. A rusted metal table stood in the center, covered with faded maps and broken equipment. On the walls, peeling posters from the war years hung, like ghostly remnants of a time long past. But it wasn't the physical objects that caught his attention. It was the whispers. Low, guttural sounds that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. He froze, straining to make sense of the words. They were a cacophony of voices, indistinct and layered over one another. But there was one that rose above the rest. It was a voice he recognized, soft yet commanding, a voice he had heard before in the depths of his memories. The woman. Her words were fragmented, but they were clear enough to send a chill down his spine. You were never meant to remember. This is your reckoning. The revelation hit Elias like a physical blow. The woman, the soldier, the memories, none of it had been real in the way he had believed. They were constructs, illusions created by something far more powerful than he had understood. The realization began to piece itself together in his mind. The memories, the war, the strange realm he had entered, it was all part of a greater plan, a design he had never fully grasped. His life had never been his own. He was merely a pawn in a game that spanned across time, a game whose rules were far beyond human comprehension. As the weight of this truth settled on him, the room seemed to warp once again. The walls stretched and twisted, the floor beneath him shifting like sand. Elias could feel his body being pulled, dragged through the distorted space. His feet left the ground, and for a moment he was suspended in midair, floating in a void where nothing made sense. He tried to scream, but the sound was swallowed by the thick, suffocating darkness. And then, in an instant, everything stopped. The room was still once more, and Elias found himself standing on solid ground again. But the shift had not been a simple change of location. It had been a change of reality itself. He wasn't in the same place anymore. The room had transformed into something else, something far more terrifying. He now stood in the midst of a battlefield. The ground was littered with bodies, some still twitching, others motionless, their eyes wide open in frozen terror. The sky above was a sickly shade of gray, swirling with clouds that seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy. The air smelled of blood and gunpowder, and the sounds of distant explosions reverberated through the ground. The war was still ongoing, but this wasn't a war he recognized. It was a war of a different time, a war that existed outside of the conventional flow of history. Elias stumbled forward, his legs weak beneath him. He looked around in disbelief, trying to make sense of the scene before him. He recognized the soldiers, the uniforms, the weaponry, but there was something wrong, something deeply unsettling about the whole situation. These were not the soldiers he had known. They were distorted, twisted versions of men, their faces warped into grotesque masks of pain and suffering. Their movements were jerky, unnatural, as though they were puppets controlled by some unseen force. And then he saw her, the woman. She was standing at the center of the battlefield, her figure bathed in an eerie light. Her face was calm, almost serene, but there was something in her eyes, a glimmer of something ancient, something knowing. She was no longer the frightened figure from his memories. She was a force unto herself, a being that transcended the mortal realm. She turned her gaze toward Elias, and in that moment, everything became clear. This had all been a lie. The war, the soldiers, the woman, they were all part of an illusion, a carefully constructed narrative meant to deceive him. The real battle was not fought in the trenches of war. It was fought in the minds of those who dared to seek the truth. And now, Elias had reached the heart of that battle. The woman spoke again, her voice carrying over the battlefield like a whisper on the wind. "You were never meant to uncover the truth," she said softly. "You were always part of the plan. The reckoning is upon you. The veil is lifted, and now you must face the consequences of your choices." The ground beneath Elias's feet trembled as the sky above darkened. The battle raged on, but Elias no longer cared. He had come to understand the true nature of the world he inhabited. It was a world built on lies, a world where the line between reality and illusion had long since blurred. And now, as the final twist of fate unfolded before him, Elias knew that there was no turning back. The reckoning had arrived, and he would have to face it, no matter the cost. The earth trembled beneath Elias as he stood, gazing into the abyss. The battlefield had vanished, leaving nothing but a vast, endless void stretching before him. The darkness was absolute, a place where time and space collapsed into an unrecognizable mass of swirling shadows. He could feel the weight of every decision, every action he had taken up until this point, pressing down on him like an invisible force. There was no sound here, no movement, only the deep, oppressive silence. For the first time since the beginning of this journey, Elias felt truly alone. He had walked through death, through lies, through twisted realities, but this was different. He could not grasp the nature of what was before him. This was not an enemy to fight or a mystery to unravel. This was something far more complex, more dangerous. In the distance, a figure began to take shape, rising out of the darkness like a specter from the past. It was the woman, the same serene expression, the same cold eyes. But now she seemed more than just a guide or a participant in the game. She was the architect of everything Elias had encountered: the war, the illusions, the truth, and the lies. She had been the constant throughout his journey, both a tormentor and a savior, depending on the perspective. She spoke then, her voice calm, measured, yet filled with an unsettling power. "Elias, you have come to the end of your journey, but this is not the end of the story." Her words were like daggers, cutting through the air with a clarity that felt unnatural. What you see before you is not the culmination of your actions. It is the culmination of something far older than you can imagine. You are the key, Elias. The key to unlocking the final chapter. Elias's heart raced. "The final chapter?" he echoed, his voice shaky. "What do you mean? What is all of this? What is the truth?" The woman tilted her head, her expression unreadable. "The truth has always been within you, Elias. It is not something to be discovered. It is something to be understood. The war, the illusions, the memories, it was all leading you here. You have been part of a larger plan, a plan that has been in motion long before you ever existed. And now, it is time for you to fulfill your role." Elias felt a coldness creep into his bones as the words sank in. He had been so focused on uncovering the truth, on understanding the madness that had consumed his life, that he had failed to see the bigger picture. He was not merely a victim of circumstance. He was part of a greater design, a cog in a machine that had been turning long before he was born. The war, the woman, the strange reality he had inhabited, none of it had been random. It had all been meticulously crafted to bring him to this point. "What is this machine?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. The woman smiled, though there was no warmth in her expression. "It is the cycle, Elias. The cycle of human existence. The endless loop of conflict, of suffering, of rebirth. You have played your part, and now it is time for you to understand the nature of your existence." Elias felt a wave of dizziness wash over him. The very foundation of everything he had believed was shattering before his eyes. The war, the battles he had fought, the comrades he had lost, it was all part of a never-ending cycle, a game that was played over and over again by forces beyond his comprehension. "The war was never the point," she continued, her voice growing more distant. "The point was to create the conditions necessary for you to awaken, to see beyond the veil. And now you will be given the choice that every soul before you has faced, to break the cycle or to continue it." Elias's mind reeled. He had always believed that he was seeking an end, a resolution to the chaos that had consumed his life. But now he saw that there was no end, only an eternal return. He could choose to break free from the cycle, but what would that even mean? Would it be a final release, or would it simply lead him to a new version of the same nightmare? The woman stepped closer, her eyes locking with his. "You have reached the final twist, Elias. The choice is yours. You can walk away, break the cycle, and leave everything behind. Or you can choose to continue, to take your place in the story once more." Elias stood frozen, the weight of the decision bearing down on him. There was no easy choice, no clear path forward. He had spent so long searching for answers, only to find that the truth was not a simple revelation. It was a question with no clear answer. The cycle would continue, with or without him. The question was whether he would choose to accept his place in it, or whether he would defy it. He took a deep breath, feeling the darkness closing in around him. In that moment, he understood something vital. The cycle was not a prison. It was a reflection of the human experience. Life was not about escaping suffering. It was about confronting it, understanding it, and ultimately learning to live with it. The woman had been right about one thing. The truth was within him all along. And so, with a final, resolute step forward, Elias made his choice. He would not break the cycle. He would not run from it. He would face it, confront it, and perhaps, just perhaps, he would find a way to change it from within. As the darkness closed in around him, Elias felt a sense of peace settle over him. The reckoning was over. The cycle continued, but he was no longer afraid of it.